I think the challenge right now is it comes back to, well, how resilient is the housing industry? Well, we're only as resilient as the consumer. And it's getting tough for consumers, right? I mean, I think we're all feeling it at this point, and some certainly much more so than others. And I think that where we are, there we can build homes. It's an affordability issue, right? People can only afford what they can afford, and I think that we
Yes.
have to continue. So there's a lot of and I'm not suggesting that we have to. The data from the National Home Builders Association talks about the component that represents regulatory oversight, and it's fairly significant what goes into entitlements and planning and everything. I'm not saying that that's the only lever we pull, but that's a pretty big lever, right? So there's a lot that goes into thinking about this holistically. And then I think we also have to kind of consider total cost of living. And this is where our work and what we've been doing with Pitch Fest and other areas and working with some of the startups in our ecosystem is it's not just how we build, it's how we live once we're in the home, how we transact to get into the home, whether that be for rental or for sale. But there's all these different aspects of life that start costing more, right? So how do we bring not only housing's total share of our wallet down, but how do we reduce the cost of all these other aspects of life that we come into contact with and kind of harmonize that a little bit too?
Welcome to Housing Matters, the podcast that covers everything real estate, from buying your first home to building your investment portfolio. Hosted by me, Matt Pouliot, of Pouliot Real Estate. Each episode brings expert insights, smart strategies, and real talk on housing and affordability. If it's about real estate, it matters here. And we are thrilled to have joining us today Dennis Steigerwalt, who is the CEO of the Housing Innovation Alliance, and so much more, which we'll get into during the course of this podcast today. Dennis and I met a couple of years ago now on the same path in terms of trying to help with housing and addressing that shortage in this country. And Dennis, I've just really been thrilled to watch your leadership through the Housing Innovation Alliance and beyond, and really thrilled to have you joining us here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Matt. Excited to be a part of the show and excited to be part of your first virtual podcast.
Yeah, so for those who are listening in, you can thank Dennis for the information on Riverside, which is this platform that we're using to help broaden out our guests beyond just the state of Maine or asking people to fly in to participate. This is a great way to kind of expand our network and our reach. So, Dennis, thanks for joining us here on the first virtual recording.
Well, I'll just add, Matt, I didn't realize that an invitation to Maine was the alternative to this, because I would have probably taken you up on that this time of year instead. So,
which you'll be doing. It's all right. It's only 6 weeks out. Only 6 weeks out. A little teaser for those listening in.
There you go.
So, Dennis, I want to get into a little bit of your background and your connection to the industry. How was it that you arrived where you are today in terms of running this organization, which has members that are part of, I think, something like 70 to 75% of new housing starts in the United States? You've got members that are affiliated with those new builds. I mean, that's a big reach. How did you get here?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a long journey, so I'll try to keep it short for your listeners here. But it's been a fun ride. So I first got a taste of the real estate development space, if you will, when I was attending the University of Pittsburgh. So as a freshman, I had an internship with a local development firm that was working on a lot of brownfield reactivation in and around the city. So Pittsburgh and its industrial legacy left a lot of blighted properties along the riverfronts, which were great for mixed use or housing plays. And it had a natural extension of many of the existing main streets and communities that those industrial properties once served. So really got an understanding of what went into creating these great places on these very, very dirty sites, right? And the complexity that goes into that. And along with it, the value it created for those communities, the families that were within them, and the folks that were involved from a business component of making that all happen. So I stayed close to that development firm for a number of years. And then when I graduated school, I actually went into a different line of work and got into wealth management and kind of did that for about 10 years, survived the great financial crisis, had a pretty solid book of business, exited that industry. And all along, I had kind of always had this. I'd always dabbled in real estate, right? So I kind of worked on my own home. I've had a number of kind of rentals and investments that I had made over the years. So when I in 2011, when I exited the wealth management space, I decided that it was time to get into kind of go back to where my heart had constantly been pulling me. And I joke now that a picture I found recently and shared at an event, my 6-year-old self would be proud as I was standing there telling the world I was going to be an architect as I was graduating from kindergarten. So haven't quite gone that way, but I am, very much involved in kind of how we think about and design the future of housing and community, as you mentioned. But in 2011, I called up a firm that was associated with the development company I worked for, which is Ibicus. They're a Pittsburgh-based research and development firm, works very closely with the Department of Energy over the years to conduct building system research and then develop new solutions and commercialize them with established industry partners. So I kind of, knocked on their door and said, look, I want in on what you're working on, and kind of dug into what they had been, a couple of their programs. And they had recently taken on an initiative in Saudi Arabia. After a breakfast with the CEO, we were booking a flight, and I was on my way over to Riyadh with Michael Dickens, the CMO at the time and founding partner, and really found it was just fascinating, right? This opportunity to help people create communities where they could thrive and do it in a way that was responsible for the environment, but also in the best possible way to deliver the homes for the industry. So I ended up working in the Middle East. That was actually my first 10 years in the construction space, or in housing in general, was based out of Dubai. And that was a strategic innovation program focused on accelerated adoptions of what they refer to as green building technologies and practices across the GCC. So really focused on Saudi Arabia, downstream industry development to have those products manufactured locally and then deployed locally in all the housing projects that they were working on. And just to create some context, Saudi Arabia at the time was looking to build 500,000 houses in 5 years, which basically that would have tripled their production in any given year. So it was a pretty substantial jump, and they were looking to do so at a lower cost, so make homes more affordable than they were in the past, more energy efficient, and they were trying to do this without a reliance on expat labor. So there was a lot of big macro goals they were looking to achieve that required some very strategic thinking. So had the opportunity to work very closely on kind of pilot homes and concept houses that showcase these solutions at work, and then developing more commercially viable solutions that would be easily scalable, and set up a number of investor partnerships and technology programs that have fairly substantial investment behind them to de-risk local investors in bringing these concepts into the market from Europe, the US, and the Far East.
That's interesting. So in Riyadh, was it the Saudi Arabian government that was focused on doing this, or was it private sector, or kind of both?
So our lead client was a group called SABIC, which is a global petrochemicals company, which, our connection to them came through a recent acquisition of GE Plastics. And the founders of Ibicus had a tie back to the team at GE Plastics. They had both had a kind of a contractual working relationship with them back in the day, and worked on some really unique future of housing type concepts that they had developed in the late 80s, early 90s. So with that acquisition, they kind of dug into their old Rolodex and found that these folks were all still focused on housing and kind of changing the way we create community. So this particular group was at the time majority owned by the Saudi government. So in a way, it was a public-private initiative, if you will, and the ultimate goal, although they were operating as on an international scale, the ultimate goal was to kind of reinvent the economy within their home country with these ideas and concepts.
So the goal there was to create, did you say 500,000 homes in 5 years?
That was the Ministry of Housing's goal and the kind of the government mandate. For us, our particular role in that was to showcase where SABIC's raw materials ended up in the products that changed people's lives in context of the built environment. We focused on, if you kind of think of it, if you look at the plot of land that a house sits on from the fence in, from the walls out. And then if you turn the house over and shake it and everything that would fall out of it, those are kind of all the concepts we were showcasing as far as what could we build better, what could be built here in Saudi Arabia. And when we say build better, thinking with a sustainability lens, productivity lens, and then again, taking out that reliance of on expat labor and just try to be smart about how we're utilizing the petrochemical resources that are in the country, keeping it in country longer for further manufacturing use versus exporting it as a barrel of oil was a much better kind of opportunity. Our goal was to build a concept house, which we called the Home of Innovation. It was a very unique showcase, a net zero energy LEED Platinum, the first of its kind in the Middle East. And then we built a 20,000 square foot exhibition space around that house that allowed us to showcase not only how we built that home, but how the other ways in which you could approach building this home and some of those other industries it touches, like consumer goods, automotive, and energy, and specifically on the renewable side. That program, we built out an entire team to kind of operate in partnership with SABIC. And that facility is actually still, that entire market engagement program is still up and running today and taking on new partners from around the world.
That's interesting. So people are just meeting you through this. They don't necessarily know that you wear a lot of hats. In addition to running the Alliance now, you're leading the Housing Innovation Alliance, but you also co-founded DXP Ventures and Build Tech VC and running Connectivity. Can you kind of walk us through how those different roles connect and maybe your experience in the Middle East, how you bring that lens into the work that you do now? Because it seems like you're really trying to look always for ways to improve systems, productivity, and affordability.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll do is I kind of dove into the whole Middle East piece, but I didn't really make the connection to the Alliance. So I'll pull that thread through first, and then I can kind of hit on some of those other hats that you mentioned, because I think they're certainly all related in pushing the kind of the housing industry or home building space forward. So in 2019, after serving as an advisor to the Minister of Housing, my family and I moved back to the U.S. And when I came back, I was kind of evaluating the business landscape within residential development and looking for the opportunity to apply the lessons that I had learned in the Middle East, the relationships that I had built with an international portfolio of companies focused on housing and housing related industries. And I reconnected with the folks at Ivicus, and they had developed this platform called the Housing Innovation Alliance. And I had worked with this platform when I was overseas, representing their group and working independently. So I understood how it operated, and we saw a huge potential to kind of come in and take what they had built over the past decade and really amplify it based off the experience I had gained and my passion to kind of really drive business results in everything that I do. So that was, early 2019, late 2019, I joined the team officially at the Housing Innovation Alliance and have been the president since. And we can kind of get into some of the things that we've changed here and there, but we just kind of wanted to connect the dots on how I landed where I am. It's interesting to think that I'm just now crossing that threshold where I worked in the US as long as I worked overseas. So that's kind of an interesting point in my career to be at. You mentioned a couple of these other hats that I wear. And so I can start with, so connectivity, I'll start there because that's an easy thread. It was the consulting firm that I started while I was based in the Middle East. So for a large period of that time, I was running the international operations for Ivicus. At a certain point, I went independent of them and started working directly with the Ministry of Housing with their support. And then that was the consulting firm that I established to create connectivity across markets, diverse stakeholder groups, and investment ideas and the right people. So the whole idea of how can we accelerate this connectivity and create some real change is where the name came from and what we've been doing. So that entity is still established and kind of supports operating programs when appropriate. But really, that was a segue for me from my work with Ivicus internationally back to the U.S. market and then into the Alliance. You talked a little bit about DXP Ventures. So all roads lead back to Dubai. DXB is actually the airport code for Dubai, and the name.
I didn't know that.
DXB is DXP Ventures is a group of us that invest in real estate in the Pittsburgh market, all of whom have spent time in the Middle East and had a presence in Dubai at some period of time, but didn't meet until we
Wait,
came
you
out.
didn't get a Boeing 747 given to you before when you left?
I think it must have shipped it to the wrong address. Mail
Yeah.
is really hard to get over there. And anybody who's lived there would know this. Like you have to have something mailed to a hotel and then go pick it up, or some extravagant post office box. It just doesn't get to you. So maybe it's lost, and I should search this out. But but it was funny to come back to Pittsburgh, and within the first few months of being back, because you're telling people your story and they're asking, what brought you back, you're finding all these other folks that have a similar story, which really surprised me. So a group of us formed DXP Ventures based, again, we all with this kind of special place in our heart that Dubai had held for all of us, and this passion we all had for real estate. So we own a portfolio of assets in and around the city of Pittsburgh, primarily focused on providing great housing to those that are connected to the universities and the healthcare system. And it's primarily single family, it's lower density housing, so single family duplexes, tris, and quads. And then we've completed some new construction work. The Picket Fence concept home, which was executed through the Housing Innovation Alliance. DXP Ventures was actually the developer and sponsor of that program through one of the lots that we have in a land bank that we control in and around the city. And then so that's kind of like the actionable part of like getting involved in building a revenue base so that we can make some investments. And that segues nicely into kind of build tech. Build tech was started amongst a group of friends over at the Builder Show a few years ago. We Sam Rubin and Alexia DeBova and I were from Mighty Buildings. We were kind of having a conversation around we really need to get behind more hardware. This is a difficult space. It's complex. How do we help the right founders kind of get these solutions into market? And that was where that was born. It has since evolved. It includes we have about 30 or so members of this angel group today. A couple other co-founders that we've brought in as well. And that's really our play to make what I'll call investments into enabling technologies that support homes that we want to build and design, and to support the concepts that we talk about within the Housing Innovation Alliance. So those are kind of how
like as an example for listeners, like the Housing Innovation Alliance talks a lot about doing things differently, in an industry where the biggest innovation seems to be the pneumatic nailer in the last 20 years. The Housing Innovation Alliance is aware of and knows of a lot of different things that are going on to improve the way that we build and maybe even change it. So to that end, I'm thinking out loud here, just as a listener, like Build Tech VC could potentially be an investor in, say, like a modular manufacturing facility or something that was then building offsite constructed homes, because we know that can be scaled better and have less waste and better for the environment, all these things. Am I tracking in the right idea in terms of like how you might utilize that, or is it more niche than even that?
No, I think you're tracking in the right way. I think as a small, we're a very early stage group, so we're making investments, seed stage and pre-seed investments in technologies that high risk, high reward, if you will, and really finding people with finding the right teams that have an idea that could have exponential impact. One of the other things, what really for me, what Build Tech allows me personally to do is kind of participate in very active conversations with a lot of other very talented people from across the industry. And it's not just home building. It could be other, infrastructure, other aspects of construction and roles that I wouldn't typically get to engage with, that we kind of bounce these ideas around and evaluate some of the opportunities. I'll also add that on the investment front, again, continue to be smarter. I also act as a limited partner in a number of other established VC firms, just in order to, again, kind of continue to have that breadth of experience and understanding of how do we find pick the winners, and how do we help promote them through the industry. One of the more recent ones I've connected up with is Home Technology Ventures, run by Chris Langford, which is closely involved with all the work we do at Pitch Fest and some of our programming as well. So again, these are all synergistic relationships, and just given my role, I believe in a lot of these. I believe in propagating the solutions that we see through the Alliance as fairly in balance as possible. So a lot of the ideas and investments that we make, part of the reason why I like being an LP, those are decisions that aren't made by me directly. Those are, and there's a lot of votes that go into them. And so for me, it's really getting to see, sometimes there are ones I wouldn't have picked, but we're going to take that ride anyway. And those have worked out, and there's others that I may have been, leading the charge on that didn't play out so well. And that's okay too.
Well, I'm curious on that front. What was one that maybe you thought was a bad idea that ended up working out okay so far?
I don't think that's a fair question for me to answer in a public setting. I appreciate you tossing it out there, Matt. What I'll say is there's things that again, this is part of the value of it. There's concepts and approaches that I wasn't as close to and familiar with, that it wasn't as obvious to me, and starting to understand how people think about it and why that's obvious, and how, if you kind of take that futurist approach, like what are the possible future states, and is this something that plays aggressively within it? It really opened my mind to just thinking differently, and having kind of really reinforce my framework for looking at these early stage companies and the founders behind them.
Yeah. So this helps you keep your iron in a lot of fires in terms of what's going on this front around housing creation and so forth. But what is the biggest, what would you say is the kind of the broader mission behind the Housing Innovation Alliance? I mean, because it connects thousands of people, and like we said, touches nearly, I guess it's over half of the new housing starts in the United States, maybe more.
Yeah, I think, we're the room where new thinking in housing is happening, right? And we have, our goal is to improve the quality of life, create better communities, higher quality homes, and do that while creating a solid business case for those that are actively involved in the industry, right? So this isn't innovation for innovation's sake. These are folks that are in the field and in the factory every day trying to get better at what they do. We're there to help shorten the learning curve. So I think, when we had our annual summit, which you've been a part of in the past, just this past week in Pittsburgh. And, one of the things I kind of described it as, I said, so two key things. One, the Housing Innovation Alliance is really it's a platform. It's this crowd accelerated innovation platform, right? So we're learning from one another. We're ping-ponging these ideas around. And what we really try to do is understand where you're at in your journey and who else in the network has taken that journey or is taking the same journey, and how we can work together to aggregate resources and learnings. And then the other thing is, the summit is really, what it was and still is in many ways our flagship convening of folks is really turned into a bit of an annual meeting. It's kind of a state of innovation within the industry conversation, right? It's 160 or so executives from across the ecosystem sharing what they're working on, and either directly or indirectly talking about the role that partners within the alliance have played within that, or folks that they've met through the network. But then also really introducing some of the things that we'd like to work on next and push forward, and inviting everyone to the table to be a part of that with us, and to, poke holes in it, right? We're not always going to get it right. So this is a learning experience for us as much as it is everybody else in the room. And that's what I'd say. If I can help you, kind of, maybe there's a more positive way to say it, but if I can help you cheat time a bit, like, this is our most precious resource. If we can all learn and stand on one another's shoulders and be taller at some point in time and get there quicker, I think this is the right way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because I was introduced to your organization through a mutual friend of ours, George, who was on this podcast earlier back in, I think, episode number 2. And then it seems like he's got this kind of cult following on people in the housing space in terms of, really being a good thought leader and so forth. But one of the things that you said just a moment ago is that we're not doing this innovation just for innovation's sake. It's really about taking action. And one of my biggest kind of takeaways from going to the summit the second year is hearing, things that were talked about the first year summit, and then coming back and seeing, oh, these actually got done, as opposed to a lot of summits that people go to and they get all jazzed up and excited and then nothing happens. To me, that's the antithesis of what the organization is about. You guys are really focused on taking action and really helping connect the dots to get this out into the real world. And it's a good segue into kind of what we're doing next, and with Maine and the road trip that we have coming up in July, because like at the University of Maine at Orono, for instance, they have wonderful technology, but their role is to innovate, and that's it. Like they could have the greatest thing that could solve the world's largest problem. I'm not suggesting that they do, but this could go in any institution, university, where they just study, look at it, and then it just stays there on a shelf and nothing actually happens with it going into the world and really affecting people's lives. And it seems to me that the Housing Innovation Alliance is really focused on, okay, it's great that you're doing this here, but how is this going to help more people, and how does this get out to more, if it makes sense to do so? And if it doesn't, like just telling people, hey, this is probably a waste of time, maybe work on something else that's going to be more constructive. It seems to be a good ecosystem to work through that on. And I'm excited about this coming to Maine. People will be listening to this about the time that we have the road trip, which is in the middle of July. And hopefully a little bit earlier to prime up what we're doing and get some more folks coming. But we have a great group of people that are slated to be coming to Maine to look at what's going on here. And some people might think, hey, Maine, like, why are we going to Maine? But because of your leadership and the foresight that you have about looking at having a broad approach to this, it makes sense, I think, to bring the network to the state and see what's going on here, because there are tremendous things going on within the forest products industry and even beyond that. And so the University of Maine at Orono, great system to 3D print a whole entire house. Right now, it's just a science project. And it might be that way if the private sector doesn't figure out a way to engage with it. And I think the Housing Innovation Alliance does a good job of saying, hey, here are some creative things, but here's how you can integrate this into the business practice, because the sector is really just slow to adopt change. And having an intermediary that studies and looks at it, it's not like you just say, hey, this is a new thing, so it's cool. I mean, you guys really spend time like you did with the Picket Fence house and other kind of projects to say, hey, here are some new technologies and here how they could work. You might want to consider incorporating them because, oh, by the way, we're anywhere from, 3 to 5 million homes, or 7, depending on who you ask, short in this country.
So you talk about this, what we refer to as our innovation and action experiences, right? These are these road trips that you talked about, like the one we're going to be doing together in Maine here. And it's hard to believe it's only 6 weeks out at this point. But we, that is part of the platform. And that's what, talking to George and Michael Dickens, who's also, vice chair with us, we kind of really working on it to keep that consistent beat of opportunity and engagement throughout the course of the year, to your point, to be able to really turn these conversations into actionable outcomes, and then to check in on that and then build on it again. And so these innovation and action experiences are a great opportunity to visit some of the hotter growth markets and see what's happening and how the community is evolving, how the housing types are evolving, how the building methods and materials in some of the early stage companies. But it's also a great opportunity to get into some of the less obvious markets, right? And maybe even the best value is to go in and kind of lift the hood up on something on a market like, I'll use Maine. Typically we're in a city, by the way, Matt. You bring me to a location where we have this.
It's the lobsters. I'm in no illusion that it's me. It's the lobster.
So, but getting folks up there is. Do
you want to come in January? No, I'm full. But July, we can definitely do July.
Yeah, we will. Yeah, I mean, look, man, we'll have a great time. It's a great time of year to be up there, but. It's about getting the right people together so that you can kind of curate an experience that brings out the best in them and allows the companies that we're visiting with to showcase the best of what they're working on. And I think that's what we're doing in Maine from an alternative methods and materials perspective is a perfect example. But you raise a good point. It's midsummer. It's a great time to get out and about. It's about being able to kind of get out, free your head a little bit. So you can be up and on the business instead of down buried in it. And I think that's one of the things that people like the most about this particular experience that we create. And I know that we have a good bit of driving to do to be able to hit all these spots that you and I have laid out, and that we have some wonderful hosts participating with us in. But we'll hey, all that bus time is talk time, right? And it's a great way to get to know some of the folks that'll be there. And I think we're going to have a great group, to your point, probably about 35 to 40 people from across the United States, maybe a third of which will end up being from the local market, but the other 2/3 traveling in, and we'll get a chance to really dig into groups like Timber HP and see what they're working on, and check out Notch SB and see some of some of the prefabricated systems they're building. I'm looking forward to meeting some of the developers in Maine that are working with some of these advanced materials, building higher performance homes and creating unique business models, for their path to market and kind of solving for some of the housing, market rate affordability challenges that we're facing nationwide. So, that's it's going to be a lot of fun. And now I'm getting excited for some brews and lobsters, as you mentioned it here.
Yeah. That's right. We'll even be getting fresh blueberries around that time. So that's good. Well, I'm excited for this because there's a lot of things that are going on here that are innovative, but they, and this is the case, I think, a lot just in the building sector in general. People get up every day, they work their tails off, they're building the built environment, and then they go home, sleep, and do it again the next day. There's not a lot of time spent sharing stories with the world about what's going on, and therefore people have kind of their preconceived notions about what things are. One example of this would be modular. A lot of people connote modular homes, which is a traditional stick-built home in a factory, with a manufactured home, which is actually more known as like a mobile home, built to a HUD standard. And they're still like lumping that together, even though it's been decades that modular homes have been built. I went in one last week that was built in 1989. It's just not a novel thing. It's just that the approach is more of a challenge in the environment that we have. And so I think having an opportunity to kind of push pause and say, hey, look, is what we're doing like the best way to be doing this? And also, look, these innovations have been made. I mean, I haven't told you this, but it's interesting. I think for the discussion we're having, a couple of weeks ago, I was at MIT. Why was I there? Well, they've developed a product that they can 3D print building materials, with plastic bottles that are dirty Coca-Cola bottles. I mean, this is a big deal because when you start thinking about beyond the United States, and like you have your Middle East experience, other parts of the developing worlds where they just don't have access to the wood fiber products maybe or whatever, but they all have what? Plastic, ton of it. So what if you could take this plastic and turn it into 2x4s? Oh, you can. And they're doing it. It's incredible, right? But if I put that plastic 2x4 in the pickup truck from Hammond Lumber Company, like I used to do, and drive down the road, and I'm like, hey, I have this new 2x4. And they're like, cool, show it to me. I'm like, here it is. And they're like, this is plastic. They're going to be like, get the heck out of here, right? And because it's just so far from what they're used to using, right? And it does take this kind of a group to pull people together around things like that, make the connections so that really where the money is can say, hey, we're investing in this. Maybe it's private equity or whatever to get it off the ground, because the chasm is so broad between where the technology is and what the consumer adoption is, because we're such a heavily regulated industry. There's so much that goes into it with codes and so forth. And I guess it's kind of a good segue into what I want to talk about, which is, how do you take your working groups within the alliance and really kind of turn those into real world action? Are there examples of projects that you've done to really show, innovation in action?
Yeah, well, I think there's a number, and what I would say is, in some way, shape, or form, most of what we talk about at the alliance, at the summit itself, has a lot of there's some level of connectivity or connection that we've made as an organization to bring some of those ideas to life. But at the end of the day, we're not the one building the homes, right? Our network members and community are. So for us, it's really about facilitating those connections, understanding who's working on similar projects. How can we help aggregate resources? Where can someone support one another, or where can our members support one another to help get a job done? I think the most recent example that I would highlight, because we did it in a very public way, was the Picket Fence that you referenced earlier, the concept house. We partnered with the team from the American Home Study, conducted a deep dive on 4,000 households around the country, aggregated that with an existing data set for 6,000 households over a period, over a 3-year period, used what we were able to gain out of that, those interviews to then design a home for a very specific cohort that would live on the site where this home was going to be, that would live in the neighborhood where this home was going to be built. So every inch of that house was designed for them based off these insights that we gained. And then the idea was, well, that's, it's wonderful to have the consumer perspective and create that livability story. But then for us, it was really important to also be able to pull in the industry buildability story, right? So I think this is where it gets into that. It also further extends that inaction component. And it wasn't that we think all homes should be built using modular construction, but to pick up on something you highlighted earlier as well, we thought this is a solution that is often overlooked and presents its, the industry with a lot of opportunities. And we wanted to create a comfort space around looking at these new types of building methods. So, or alternative types of building methods. So we partnered with a local factory, and a local general contractor and built the concept home using volumetric modular construction as an infill solution. And then told the story through the lens of a build to rent developer or a retail developer looking to sell these units in this market. So I think that was one, just the process of, and we followed that entire journey through Professional Builder magazine, right? So it was an idea home for last year. We documented everything. It lives on a microsite. It's all still out there. When we completed it, we have a family living in the ground floor unit, which is a wonderful ADU that's 700 square feet. And then we have a couple that's living in the upper unit, which is a 2-story, 3 bed, 2.5 bath townhome. This is about, and that is what we've done is two things, again, to continue this inaction piece. So one, we partnered with the Department of Energy and IBICUS to track the energy consumption through the hot winter months and demonstrating, tracking the energy performance, not only of the envelope, but also the new air distribution technology we use within the home. But then we're also currently now partnering with HUD as part of an exercise to understand how is the home lived in, and are those expectations of the consumer being met? Are they aligning with what we learned through the study? So again, just kind of creating that feedback loop. So this is now a living laboratory, and it will be for several more months. And that's a research partnership with the University of Pittsburgh, HUD, and a number of others that has an industry focus group component to it that allows us to understand, well, this is how we built this one. How would you build it differently using other methods and other materials? So really trying to dig into some of the barriers to adopting offsite construction or system-built housing practices. So what I'm trying to do is show this is something we started in 2022 that is still, this is one example of something that's very visible for us and that we were able to showcase at the summit last week, of how we're bringing innovation to action and continuing to build on our storyline and move the needle forward. There were a number of working groups and conversations that we've had and involvement with other organizations that allowed us to get to the point where we were able to do that one. There's other examples in the network, emerging technology companies that are looking at new building methods or systems, being able to deploy those technologies in specific divisions with, large production builders. There's the opportunity to work with various developers in kind of their, entire concept neighborhoods, if you will, and how those technologies are being deployed. So those are some of the things that we're seeing, where that innovation meets action, to kind of get back to your point there.
Yeah. Do you suspect, or what are some of your key takeaways as to why, only 5% of the housing in the United States is built offsite? Is it because we're constantly trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, or is it that it's actually a square peg that we are just still searching for the square hole because it's out there somewhere? Is it really possible in the United States with our plethora of zoning and local control to actually have a systematic approach to building housing?
Yeah, well, I think you certainly have pockets where it's more successful than others, right? I think, just where you and I are both based in the Northeast, so we'll kind of fall in on that. I believe I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, if I'm right, I think we have more modular housing factories than any other state at this point, or
Yeah.
pretty darn close to this.
Yeah, and Pennsylvania put a law in the books that you couldn't like go through the state with a manufactured home without paying some crazy levy, which was pretty smart, since the majority of the roads have to go through there to get anywhere from the Northeast.
Well,
So much for arbitraging cheap homes from Canada.
So, but the point being, we have, we have created an ecosystem here where it can be successful. And, whether that's legislation like you just described, whether that is a very strong statewide program to endorse and advocate for industrialized housing practices, as we refer to it here in the state of Pennsylvania. So there's state level approvals that cannot be overridden at the local jurisdiction. So there's examples where this works, right? I think geographically, the reason I dialed in on the Northeast is, the Northeast has the highest adoption rate of volumetric modular construction of any market in the country. I think there's a lot of opportunity to expand on that. I think if you get outside of modular, I think, look, we're seeing a lot higher adoption of, roof trusses, you think about components, roof trusses, wall panels, floor cassettes. This is all happening, right? And it's happening. I think we're starting to see more and more. But I think the flexibility of what you see coming through from some of these panelized options that I just mentioned makes it a little bit easier to digest. Plus, you're taking out it's incremental changes with existing trades. When you go volumetric modular, you're changing the entire operating landscape. So you need an ecosystem that can support that. And now you asked a very big question. Like, there's no one silver bullet as to how we solve all of this, unless we were able to come up with a harmonized national building code that is actually implementable in every market. For these solutions that are built, that is built to the IRC. Then I think, by climate zone, then, if you can start to see these modules being able to be more easily transported from market to market and kind of create a different level of scale. But there's still a lot of fragmentation that exists in that space. There's issues, there's concerns and valid ones around capital outlays and the financing structures and how how modular projects are delivered, right? And how so the financing mechanism, which there's pieces to overcome that. But then there's the stability of the factories that you're working with and their ability to meet your demand. So there's a couple of things that we need to dial in on. But there is with it a lot of opportunity. Folks that have figured it out, they're quietly working away. Well, some not so quietly, but many of them are working away just very smoothly and able to execute to these projects. We were just out in Denver last week touring with a team that's using volumetric modular now for like the last 15 years. And they'll never turn back. They set I want to say it was a 50 plus unit apartment building. They set it in 7 days, right? Which, takes time in the factory to build. So I'm not discounting. It was not a 7-day build, but they were able to set it in 7 days. So the ability to get in and have stairs to the top of your 4-story building immediately is pretty nice, right? And there's a lot of safety benefits in doing that in the way that they're able to build them within the factory. So and you're in and out of that neighborhood, so you're not disrupting the neighborhood as much as you would with a traditional build. So there's some obvious benefits, and we can go on and on about those. I think what it comes down to is it takes momentum, it takes an ecosystem, and everybody you gotta continue to chisel away at folks getting more and more comfortable with it, and bringing the legislative piece along the side of it to ensure that we have the appropriate codes, training, and financing mechanisms in place to make it viable.
Yeah, and these things just take time. I was introduced to the innovation that's going on in Colorado as it relates to their investments to give money to build factories and get more housing built and everything. And now I port that back to Maine and start talking to policymakers here about it. I'm not in the Senate anymore, but there's a person who is in the Senate who was very big in volumetric construction 25 years ago. It's big in his district. He gets it. He's like, hey, what they're doing in Colorado is using state resources to invest in getting these things off the ground. Not just, building the whole building, but also maybe standing up a panel factory or making it possible for a plywood manufacturer to open here or something where we're making stuff and creating foundational jobs. And so now he has a bill in to create a bond to do that. So as long as that gets passed this fall, then there'll be, tens of millions of dollars going into this. But then that gets stood up, and then it takes a couple of years to people. It seems like the fruits of this labor, if you will, are a lot longer out than if we were running an alliance on like an AI company or something. Like it just seems like the industry, there's all this innovation and smart things and everything, but the inertia, it just seems like you're pushing a rock uphill in this industry, and it doesn't mean we stop pushing, because if not, we'll all get flattened. But it just seems like a long time to affect change on this front sometimes.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of stakeholders involved, right? And I think there's my position on this has been for the past few years. There's a lot more happening than we know about, and it does take time. But there's trees that have been planted years ago, right? And we're going to start to see them take root and start to blossom.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things, and we're seeing it, right? There's more public announcements from significant players of investments they've made and the successes or failures of those and the lessons learned. And I think that we're also, some research that we completed recently with the team from Ivory Innovations and Professional Builder in their top 200 housing survey, or housing provider survey, it really is revealing in that last year we found that 25% of respondents had a dedicated innovation function. Now that ranges in size and scale, so let's not, it's hard to compare apples to apples across different teams and divisions, but 25% acknowledging a commitment to innovation through a dedicated resource is a big deal. This year, the number is up to 32%. And, we know the audience pretty well. If I scan that list, I can see a few others that maybe have yet, have not responded to that specific question, or maybe are not considering the level of investment they've made to be a dedicated function, but they're there. So my point is, this kind of commitment to technology development, to screening and deploying these technologies in your divisions and in your business is becoming table stakes, right? So, I think you're going to have your skeptics. You're going to have a lot more folks that are curious, and curiosity leads to, experimentation and acceptance. And I think those.
Well, like as an example, last week I sent an email to the code enforcement officer of my town. I'm like, hey, I want to buy a Boxable and build it here. This is an offsite manufactured box. Boxable's not selling to the public yet, by the way, but they are queuing up a list, which now has 190,000 people on it waiting. And he looks at the plans. Boxable's pretty cool. They put all their plans right up online so people can see and do things like send it for a building permit. And he's like, well, this is only designed with a 40-pound snow load for the roof, which is fine if you're in, California where they're built, but not, actually they're built in Las Vegas, I guess. But anyway, no snow, right? But Maine, there's snow. And so you could have somebody that's like local, and I'm curious, I want to kind of talk about this because I know a lot of your members are representing bigger cohorts of builders and stuff, but it seems like there needs to be an engagement too of the small mom and pop guys that are just doing 5 or 6 a year. Because if you've got 50,000 people doing 5 a year, that's 250,000 homes. It's a significant, number of properties, but it's not on the Toll Brothers scale where they're doing, 50,000 one company or more. So the question is like, how do you get, and the reason I bring this up about Boxable is because it seems to me from a consumer perspective, people are going more toward pick something that's already done, okay? Because they're busy. There's a lot of decisions to make in life now. With smartphones and all this, the human brain is having to make so many more decisions than ever had to in history, just in the last 25 years. And that's a whole separate episode. I don't think our brains are actually wired, the majority of us, to keep up with that. And as such, on the new construction side of things, people are just not patient. They don't want to wait or whatever. So they see an option like this. Oh, Boxable, that's good. It's got the size that I need. It's the space and everything. And then they send it to, I'll call him Paul Blart Mall Cop, the code enforcement officer, who's like, sorry, this doesn't fit here. And they're like, what, I wanted to buy new jeans last week. I didn't have to call you and ask if I could wear these walking down Main Street. So the challenge is you have the consumer demand through the roof. I mean, housing inventory is so low in this country, and you have real life solutions like that. But it just seems like unless we address this code piece or somehow figure out a way in the factory to get this built in without it driving up the costs, it's like going to be, I don't know. It just feels like it's going to be stuck. We're going to keep doing it the same way because the code here is like this, and then 2 zip codes over it's this, and never the two shall meet.
It's a great point you raise, and I think maybe one of the points that came up in our National Housing Supply Summit in DC earlier this year, which you and I were able to connect at. Really came, there was a lot of conversation around like what's happening in, the push to harmonize codes across municipalities in a state like Colorado, for example, because of the investments that they've made. And I think you'll see more of this. I think you're going to see some, one of the predictions I made coming out of last year is that we're going to see a lot more state level leadership, a lot more governors taking lead to charge to do some of the things that you described that's happening, with Governor Polis in Colorado, seeing some of the push from within the state of Maine. There will be more like this in order to help kind of solve the supply demand problem or to help try to bridge that gap. One thing I want to pull on though a little bit that you mentioned is the demand side of it, right? And I think the challenge right now is it comes back to, well, how resilient is the housing industry? Well, we're only as resilient as the consumer. And it's getting tough for consumers, right? I mean, I think we're all feeling it at this point, and some certainly much more so than others. And I think that where we are, we can build homes. It's an affordability issue, right? People can only afford what they can afford, and I think that we have to continue. So there's a lot of and I'm not suggesting that we have to, the data from the National Home Builders Association talks about the component that represents regulatory oversight, and it's fairly significant what goes into entitlements and planning and everything. I'm not saying that that's the only lever we pull, but that's a pretty big lever, right? So there's a lot that goes into thinking about this holistically. And then I think we also have to kind of consider total cost of living. And this is where our work and what we've been doing with Pitch Fest and other areas and working with some of the startups in our ecosystem is, it's not just how we build, it's how we live once we're in the home, how we transact to get into the home, whether that be for rental or for sale. But there's all these different aspects of life that start costing more, right? So how do we bring not only housing's total share of our wallet down, but how do we reduce the cost of all these other aspects of life that we come into contact with and kind of harmonize that a little bit too? And I think there's opportunities for this, and that, there's community very forward to get communities to think about that from a mobility perspective, from a health insurance perspective, from an education.
But you guys, this is a good point. I want to pause here for a moment, because I think what I've learned and taken away from being involved with the Alliance is to look at this more globally and also consider other players, like, because you have such amount of institutions involved, whether they're, lenders or, community, public, municipalities, and the list goes on. But the lending side is really where a lot of this kind of stops, because let's say I wanted to do this boxable home in Maine. Okay. I want to be using an innovative product. The first one went to Tesla and they've got this neat thing going, and it's $79.99. I can afford that. Okay. Yes. Sign me up. And then the bank's like, well, we don't have any comps around here to use, so we're not going to lend any money on that. Or we only lend to 30% debt to income ratio, because they're factoring in all these other things like electricity cost, heating cost, water and sewer, all of these things, which if you take all of these innovative things that are in a home like Picket Fence or some of these other ones, those costs are much lower than what they would be in a more traditional, yet the bank is still just looking through the same black and white lens of, we're only going to 35%. Well, I mean, to build all of these things in on the front end is way more expensive. Mm-hmm. So why wouldn't you lend me more as a percentage when I can demonstrate back to you that there's going to be a savings, which that money would be used for either way? You get my point? Because we've had this conversation a lot in Maine, and I'm curious if the Alliance has unpacked this. We have, on the one hand, we want to have a uniform building code, so everybody's playing by the same level. We can systematize and scale a lot easier and all that. And on the other hand, that might be overkill for one area or underkill for another area in terms of the environment, the climate. And also in Maine, we live in a cold climate where you have to add a lot of insulation to meet the new code standards for energy efficiency. But Maine people don't actually make the level of money that you need to make to afford the cost per square foot to actually construct that. And so you have this stranded situation where someone's working their tail off, 50-hour week, both of them, 2 jobs, got kids, doing everything we're asking them to do as American citizens, right? And it still just doesn't add up. And if you look at the code, you're like, hey, and George mentioned this in our podcast, he's like, I almost feel like the only way to move the needle is create one zip code where you just do whatever the heck the math works for and just see what comes out. Like, people are not going to build a house that's going to fall down on them. Maybe 1 or 2 people in the community, but most people are going to want to live in a safe environment. They're going to want to have heat when it's freezing outside, but they maybe decide that they only need 1 electrical outlet in the room instead of 10. Now, is this going to erase enough to make the whole difference? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. It could be 10, 15, 20, 30% more cost. Right. And so we're in this weird situation where we're looking out for people's best interests, yet we've got to a point where they actually can't afford what it is that we're looking out for them to do. And I think, like, okay, great, problem identified. That's cool. Well, what do you do about it? I think that the only way around that is demonstrating through third-party evaluation that, this built in a factory environment or this kind of thing here with data, we can show that it's going to be less expensive to operate. And you've been collecting a lot of that data and so forth, but it's like, I guess at what point does that make it to the banks? Kind of bring us full circle here, why I brought up the banks and is that work being done like on a policy level to change how they evaluate? Because that's a super highly regulated industry.
Yeah. So I can't speak to if that's happening or not. What I can kind of relate it back to is, I look at everything that we do is, there's a change management, a fairly significant change management component to it all, right? To bring a new technology in, whether that be in the office or in the field. And I think what you described is, again, another part of that equation where it's an education process, it's a demonstration, and it's like most things, you kind of have to prove that it works. And I think having real data points and resources, and there are folks that are, I have seen folks that are out there really dialing in on kind of the green appraisal, like getting really good at that, helping real estate agents understand how to market and communicate the value proposition behind homes that have some of these certifications or that have certain technologies and materials in them. Because it's going to take coming in at all these different parts of the ecosystem to kind of slowly raise the tide on that. I think that also said, and I think it's probably easier in that case for smaller players to do things than it is for some of the larger ones. And I say that only because they could be a little bit more nimble and go in and kind of try some of these, use personal relationships to get with the bankers and the appraisal groups. Now there's to your point, it's highly regulated. There's certain things you just have to do, but there are places like, I use a Picket Fence as an example. Again, the depth of notes that was provided as to what we did and how we did it from a technology and performance perspective was more than I had ever seen. And I believe that resonated with our financial, with our lending partner, and we saw the value of that home increase year over year through the appraisal we issued.
If someone were listening to this and say like Portland, Maine, or Manchester, New Hampshire, or San Diego, whatever, and they wanted to replicate what you did with the Picket Fence, is that publicly available information that they could take to a company and say, "Hey, build me this"?
Yeah, I can send you the website and you can share it in the show notes. ProBuilder had it was a ProBuilder idea home website that they had hosted. It's still available in a slightly different format now, so you can get into the knitting on that. And then we also, through the research partnerships work with the University of Pittsburgh, I mentioned previously, we're going to be rebooting all the work that we did with. We're going to be sharing even more than what was in the original kind of content stream. And then kind of continue to follow that journey, what we've learned as we go. Because look, there's a lot you can learn about what you could do, market, geography by geography. But there's also a lot that I would say that we learn what not to do. Right. And sometimes, and I say that with a smile for those that can see the video, because there's some just, you look back and there's some things you're like, wow, what were we thinking?
Never thought that.
How do we miss that? Right. And then there's other things you go, wow, that worked out 10 times better than I would have expected. Right. So I think there's to to the point, that's why we want to create this communications platform to be able to share those experiences and help accelerate the learning curve for the industry.
So I want to kind of end on a forward-thinking view here with some big predictions.
Yeah.
And you and I have talked about this in the past a little bit, but for those listening, what are some of your big predictions on where housing's going, particularly as it relates to things like, foreign capital, micro factories, and state-led programs?
Yeah, well, I think, so I'll talk more macro and some of the things that I think we're going to see get continued traction in the marketplace first. So I think, you hit a number of them from our past conversations. I've already talked about more state level leadership and kind of these incentive programs to look at solving for housing as a local economic development strategy as well, or a statewide economic development strategy. So the scaling of existing operations, the upskilling of the workforce, the relocation of other innovative methods and materials from other markets into your market and help, so I think there's that whole component. And I think there's big piece of that is making sure you don't focus so much on the supply side, but you also make sure you marry up the demand side and create the right incentives to bring them together. Because when I worked in the Middle East, we had two very clear teams. There was a supply team working on de-risking investment in new technologies, and then there was a demand aggregation group and understanding how they unlock that. And I think that's where there's a huge potential. So bringing those two together, I think one of what we're talking about, kind of some of the things on, you talked about uniform codes, and I'll get into just reminds me of this other point. Like this we have a lot of folks that are kind of going to be retiring in the industry, right? There's a lot of wisdom in the marketplace, and we all heard the numbers, right? Two framers out for everyone in, and the numbers continue to get the 6-figure digits on folks retiring annually, with much lower numbers coming in generally across the board. I think that this idea of leveraging technology to codify the wisdom of the industry, and I used, you would have seen them when you were out in Denver, but On3 and their technology platform as a training tool and a way to establish standards and then verify those standards have been met, kind of supercharges your team. Really, it enables them in real time, but then also keeps them engaged in learning over a period of time. I think there's a lot of potential for platforms like that. That's one that's in the field. Another one that was out in Denver with us that same year, or the year before, it's a group called ARCS. And ARCS, I think what they're doing from a site assessment and feasibility perspective, really can help smaller teams go a lot faster in understanding if a project makes sense. And then I think there's this ability to take, kind of the deal analysis that happens inside of an organization. If you have a division that does this really well, how do you translate that across the division? So that's another one on this codification of the wisdom. I think micro factories, you talked a bit about modular. We've talked about panelized. I think the idea that if we can reduce the CapEx that goes into these new solutions, this is a trend. When I was working overseas, we were focused big on gigafactories, and you saw a lot of that when I was entering into the U.S. market, 2019, 2020. I think, coming up with localized solutions that serve 200 to 500 units a year, that a regional or smaller builder can kind of bite that off, or partner with others to do it. I think that's a model that will pilot quickly and we'll learn from very fast. And we're seeing a lot of those types of solutions circling our marketplace, right, or circling within our network right now. And then the last point you raised, and I think is, we've been hitting this note for a while, is the influence of foreign capital. And these transactions are big and small, right? Some of them are fairly robust strategic plays, but I think we're in the very early innings of seeing, institutional capital from established players come out of established housing players and real estate players out of markets like Japan, start to take hold in our market based off of kind of they're facing, kind of demographic headwinds, and they have very, very low cost of capital. So we are a ripe opportunity to bring generations of insights and experience and technology advancements, and do it at a very measured pace. So buying great operating companies, and then learning them, and then slowly turning the dial. So I think that, and that's going to happen on a number of different fronts, whether it's, the development, the building side, building products, and even trade contractors. So I think there's going to be, those are kind of four things that tie into some of the way money's moving and the way technology is supporting what the industry, how the industry is evolving.
That's exciting stuff to hear. And for those who have tuned in today and are listening, Dennis, if they want to learn more about the work that you're doing, what I've dubbed the Silicon Valley for the housing industry, the incubator of good ideas and all the good work on the housing innovation front, where can people go to learn more about the work that you're doing and what's going on with the Alliance?
Well, I think first and foremost, they can come visit you and I in Maine, July 16th and 17th, right?
That's right.
But if they're only able to engage with us virtually at first, I would say housinginnovationalliance.com. It would be the best place. And then I'll obviously happy to share my email in the show notes as well, and they can reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to kind of connect with them.
Awesome. Well, Dennis, thanks for joining us on our first virtual version of our Housing Matters podcast as we expand our network beyond the borders of Maine to get more bright ideas from around the country and beyond. We're really thrilled to have had you on here today. And thanks for bearing with us as we work through some of the technology pieces to get this part of our podcast off the ground.
Yeah. No, fantastic, Matt. Happy to be here. And thanks for the opportunity. Look forward to seeing you here in a few weeks.
Yes. See you soon, man. Have a great day.
You too. Take care.